President Carter's White House statement tonight marked the end of an extraordinary 13-day period where the leaders of the United States, Egypt, and Israel engaged in the most intensive diplomatic effort yet to negotiate an end to 3 decades of conflict in the Middle East.
We are privileged to witness tonight a significant achievement in the cause of peace, an achievement none thought possible.
During World War I, Palestine, a part of the Ottoman Empire, was occupied by the British Army. With growing anti-Semitism, Jews around the world immigrated to Palestine, their homeland, that was inhabited by an Arab majority. In 1947, the UN decided to partition Palestine into Israel with a Jewish majority and Palestine with an Arab majority. Jerusalem was kept as a neutral zone. As the British mandate ended on May 14, 1948, Israel proclaimed its independence with American recognition. The very next day, the neighboring Arab countries invaded Israel, starting the First Arab-Israeli War. Israel won the war and gained even more territory. A series of Arab-Israeli conflicts ensued.
The Suez Crisis in 1956. Egypt secured the Suez Canal. The Six-Day War in 1967. Israel took over the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, humiliating the Arab world. After this, the UN passed Resolution 242, calling for all Israeli troops to withdraw from occupied territories and Arab states to accept Israel as a nation.
Anwar Sadat, who became president of Egypt in 1970, was determined to regain Egyptian land. In 1973, Egypt and Syria, with Soviet support, launched a surprise attack on Israel on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. Israel ended up winning the war with U.S. support, reclaiming its land, albeit with heavy losses. However, the myth of Israeli invulnerability was shattered, and Sadat was regarded as a hero in the Arab world.
As the U.S. supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War, Arab nations started an oil embargo, resulting in an oil crisis. At the same time, Sadat wanted the Soviets to leave Egypt and establish relations with America. The U.S. wanted to protect its oil and economic interests in the region, as well as minimize the geopolitical Soviet influence in the Middle East. Hence, in 1973, the U.S. Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, started the diplomatic effort to bring peace to the Middle East.
After Jimmy Carter took office in 1977 as the U.S. president, he took a special interest to resolve the Middle Eastern conflict. Meanwhile, in Israel, Menachem Begin, a conservative nationalist, was elected as the prime minister. Carter appealed to Sadat, asking him to initiate peace talks. Sadat recognized the immense potential for Egypt's growth if the war-inflicted drain on the country's resources could be offset by diplomacy. In an unprecedented move, Sadat became the first Arab leader to visit Israel and spoke to the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, thus breaking what he called the psychological barrier. This led to Begin reciprocating and going to Egypt. However, both parties could not come to an agreement. Carter proposed a meeting for peace talks at Camp David to Sadat and Begin.
On September 5th, Sadat and Begin arrived at Camp David, a military base located in Maryland, which serves as the U.S. presidential retreat. It was chosen as it was secluded and was private from the press.
The initial plan was for negotiations between Egypt and Israel to take place over 3 days, with the U.S. acting as a mediator. Carter soon realized that Begin and Sadat were unable to work together. Carter later said there was no compatibility between the two. Carter's solution was to have the U.S. delegation come up with a proposal after independent negotiations with both Egypt and Israel. Carter then presented it to Begin and Sadat separately. At different times during the summit, Begin and Sadat expressed a desire to leave Camp David, but with timely interventions from Carter, the leaders stayed.
I had given up, and my wife had gone back to Washington to prepare for our return to Washington in defeat, a failure. Begin asked me for a signed photograph of me and him and Sadat to each one of his 8 grandchildren. So instead of just saying best wishes Jimmy Carter, I got my secretary to get their names, and I put with love and best wishes too, and I put his names of his grandchildren. And when he got the photographs, he was quite angry with me at the time. He just said, "Thank you, Mr. President," and turned around and he began to read. And he called out the name of his first grandchild, and then he called out the name of his second grandchild, and he had tears running down his cheeks, and so did I. And then he said, in effect, "Why don't we try one more time?"
Diplomatic negotiations were underway for months leading up to the Camp David Accords. During the summit, both Sadat and Begin had to make concessions. Sadat agreed to separate the Egyptian and Palestinian frameworks, leading to alienation by his delegation and the Arab world.
It was a real shock for us. Our main preoccupation was to avoid a bilateral agreement between Israel and Egypt at the expense of the Palestinians.
Begin was firmly against dismantling any Israeli settlements by himself. The delegations worked around this with a plan to present the proposal to the Knesset. Begin and Sadat were dissatisfied with the Jerusalem issue, so it was taken out of the framework. After intense bargaining, 13 days of debates and negotiations, and 23 versions of the frameworks, the Camp David Accords, a landmark of Middle Eastern diplomacy, came to a close.
On September 17, 1978, the Camp David Accords, a 2-part framework for peace, was signed. The framework for peace in the Middle East was a multi-stage plan for Palestinian autonomy. The second part, titled Framework for the Conclusion of a Peace Treaty between Egypt and Israel, advocated for the withdrawal of Israeli troops from the Sinai Peninsula, and Egypt had to open the Suez Canal.
10 days later, the Knesset approved the framework. However, Begin realized his coalition, Likud, wasn't happy with the concessions he made, so he tried to delay the treaty. After a few months, it seemed like all progress made at Camp David was grinding to a halt. Carter, contrary to his advisors' input, visited Israel and Egypt to persuade Sadat and Begin to come to an agreement. His endeavor succeeded, and they arrived at the White House on March 26, 1979, to sign the official peace treaty.
The peace treaty is a great example of diplomatic success, as in the 42 years since it was signed, Egypt and Israel have never gone to war. Sadat and Begin won the 1978 Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts. Egypt regained the Sinai Peninsula, and they forged closer bonds with the U.S., gaining both economic and military aid. Israel gained diplomatic recognition and split Egypt from the Pan-Arab coalition. The U.S. gained strategic alliances and presence in the Middle East, pushing the Soviets out. The treaty paved the way for future peace initiatives between Israel and the Arab world.
After the Accords, Egypt was expelled from the Arab League. However, Sadat paid the biggest price. He was assassinated on October 6, 1981, by pan-Arab nationalists from Egypt who were enraged with the peace treaty. Begin faced resistance from his party, who were unhappy with the concessions he made. The Palestinian framework was not successful due to a multitude of reasons.
The real protagonists weren't there. The Palestinians weren't present, and it was all about Palestine. It was all about the future of the Palestinians, and Sadat grandiosely said, "Oh, well, I can speak for the Palestinians."
The Palestinians rejected the agreement as they wanted statehood, not autonomy.
Also, Menachem Begin's agreement on the issue was tentative at best, and the agreement was vague. Finally, Sadat was counting on support from other Arab nations. However, Saudi Arabia, their strongest ally, did not agree to it and condemned it.
Palestinian autonomy was never achieved, and Israel continued creating settlements in West Bank and Gaza. Nationalist movements gained strength in Palestine, inciting nationalistic sentiments in Israel as well. Today, the conflict between Palestine and Israel still needs to be resolved, but the Camp David Accords reminds us that concerted diplomatic efforts from the international community, though at times imperfect, can help resolve conflicts, resulting in a lasting peace between nations. Its legacy and profound impact on Middle Eastern diplomacy will always be remembered.
The bond of our common humanity is stronger than the divisiveness of our fears and prejudices. We can choose to work together for peace. We can make these changes, and we must.